Okay, let's welcome our speaker for this evening. We're super grateful that Venus has joined us because not only is it a busy time of year for her as it is for all of us, but she's also in the first term of a new job. So that is a particular challenge, and we're really grateful that she's made time to come. So I'll read a little bit of a biography. I haven't checked this with Venus in advance, so I hope I get this right, Venus. But Venus is now Associate Professor of Environmental History post-1750 at St Anne's College at the University of Oxford. She was previously at the University of York, and as I say, moved beginning of this term. And Venus is really interested in the connections between environmental, economic, and European history, and she's currently working on some really interesting projects. I have to say, Venus, looking at the information online, you call your projects really interesting names. So one's called Falling for Growth, which is looking at the influence of economic thought on anthropogenic climate change, and the other one's called Unsafe Harbour. What a great name for a historical project, which is analysing the history of industrial pollution and port development in southern France. So super interesting work. Michael and I heard Venus talk at the historical conference last May. We both really enjoyed it. I don't think I've ever tried to make notes so quickly in a talk before, because everything was just spot on for what I was interested in at the time.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, Star, I think you've got your microphone on.
So sorry.
No problem at all, don't worry. So delighted to have you here, Venus, and I'm going to hand over to you, if that's okay.
Yes, great, thank you. I should say that I have a friend with a gift for titling things, and so actually he titles almost all of my work. He reads it and then he just has these amazing ideas for titles. So I should give credit to Alex Dubé, an historian of early France in Canada. And I was delighted to hear that you said that we've got British, American, and Canadian people in the audience, since I hold citizenship in all three of those places and grew up in Canada. So it's nice to have my entire geographical history represented here this afternoon. Right, so thank you everybody for tuning in on a rather dark November. So I'm going to talk about climate and economic growth. And I want to do three broad things with the talk. And the first one is to think about the rise of fossil fuel consumption and how that relates to economic growth and democracy. And then the second thing I want to do is talk about examples of environmental awareness in history. I think there's a broad assumption, especially amongst my undergraduate students, that humans were not aware of their effect on the climate or the environment, for that matter, until the 20th century. And we have lots of evidence, of course, in the historical record that that was not the case. And then the last thing I want to do is talk about what constitutes normal patterns of energy consumption and how history might help us to rethink how we understand that standard. I'm also now remembering that I have slides. Alison, do you have to make me a host for people to see?
I've already enabled you to share, so that's fine. You go ahead.
Let me share screen. Oh, apparently I have to. Oh, shoot. Okay. I have very tight security on my Oxford computer. Hang on a second.
If it's easier to email it to me, I can share it.
I think I should be okay.
Okay.
Let's see.
Yep.
Got it?
Yeah, perfect.
Let me turn it into slideshow mode. Brilliant. Okay. So I think that one of the biggest contributions that historians can make to thinking about climate change is to refine our understanding of how economic growth and the rise of mass production and mass consumption relied on the existence of cheap and abundant fossil fuels. And so for that, I want to take us back to the Industrial Revolution. And so, as many of you know, as British people who went through the British school system, right, in 1781, the English mechanical engineer James Watt invented the first efficient and usable kind of steam engine, and forever changed history. And what most of us think about when we think about the early steam engine, of course, is railways, right, ships. But the first major use of the steam engine was actually coal extraction. And so a lot of the coal in Britain at the time was located in mines that were very easily flooded and full of water. And the steam engine fixed this problem by providing an efficient way of pumping that water out of the coal mines. And so, I mean, I still boggle when I think about this, right? That a machine was invented to extract coal from the earth, and the thing that was used to power the machine was coal, right? And so you end up with this very bizarre circle, right, in which every improvement on the steam engine made it easier to take coal out of the earth. It also increased the possible applications of the steam engine because more coal was available, right? And then, of course, that increased the demand for even more coal. And so you've got this snowball effect, right? And so before long, of course, the steam engine was being used to do lots of things, not just pumping water out of coal mines. And perhaps one of the most important things that it did was replace water wheels in the operation of textile mills, which greatly improved the efficiency with which these textiles were produced. And of course, textiles were one of the driving forces behind the Industrial Revolution and all of the economic growth that came with that. It's also the case, of course, that the transportation of those textiles became a lot easier, getting ahead of myself, and less expensive when people started putting steam engines into railway cars and into ships, which happens in the first decades of the 19th century. And so now goods are much more easily and much more cheaply moved, right? Not only within Britain, but also across the globe. And so here, not just the textiles that are largely driving the Industrial Revolution, but also things like porcelain, maybe from the Wedgwood factory, right? Or an increasingly diverse array of foodstuffs. And the more coal that we took out of the earth, the more easily it became for these goods to circulate globally. And here's a chart showing the rise of coal extraction. And of course, no surprise, right, that there's a big increase at about 1800, so just after the Newcomen engine was being used more widely. And then, of course, a massive spike after the middle of the century. So all of this leads to massive amounts of economic growth. And as you can see from the slide here, it's a really similar graph to coal consumption, but we've got economic growth in more or less every corner of the world in the 19th century. Africa, not until the 20th century, and of course, still lagging behind quite a bit. And this is something that I don't talk about in the talk, but maybe something we can talk about in the Q&A, but the effect of decolonization in the 20th century. And you can see that operating on this graph in the middle of the 20th century. Right, so massive amounts of economic growth. And this growth produced really important social change. And I could talk about nothing else for the rest of our time together, right, and still barely scratch the surface. But for the purposes of what I want to cover with the talk, I'll say maybe just two things. And the first is that while still difficult, of course, social mobility became easier than it had been. And then the second thing is that the middle class became a much more important social category. And of course, historians continue to argue about when and where the middle class exactly emerged. But I feel like it's fairly safe to say that at the very least, right, the Industrial Revolution caused a spike in its expansion. And the second thing to say about big changes in the sort of social fabric is a global point, right? And so until the Industrial Revolution, levels of wealth across the planet were fairly similar. And so what that means is that, you know, if you were a king in England or you were a king in Japan, your life materially was more or less the same. And if you were a peasant in France or a peasant in what is now Mali, your life looked more or less the same as well, right? Fast forward to 2023, it seems pretty clear to all of us that it's much better to be a farmer in France than it is to be a farmer in Mali. And a lot of that is the result of this big discrepancy in economic growth that hits in the 19th century. And so again, just looking at this graph, even though more or less everybody experiences some kind of growth, it's clear, right, that Western Europe, which is blue, and the United States, which is green, Canada, of course, never makes it onto these things, those both experience much higher rates of growth. Japan as well, but just a little bit later. So that's the sort of general 19th century setup. The invention of the steam engine creates a world in which coal is both abundant and cheap, which in turn creates a world in which economic growth leads to massive social change, marked by both a significant increase in the middle class and the creation of global disparities in wealth distribution. And so I want to make 2 points about these developments. And the first point is that those who were lucky enough to enjoy the fruits of the Industrial Revolution grew accustomed to their new normal very quickly. Prior to the advent of the steam engine, humans largely relied on renewable sources for their power needs, so things like wood or water, draft animals. Coal, of course, was used a little bit, as was peat, but these other sources were far more important. It's also the case that most humans were farmers. Most of them had little contact with cash money. They lived in small communities, right, with mutual credit. And then in the space really of about 2 generations, humans become utterly dependent on non-renewable coal. English men and women take it for granted that they can get on a ship and go to places like America or Australia. They take it for granted that shops will carry a variety of goods that they hadn't seen before, possibly from as far away as Latin America. They also get used to drinking tea, right, rather than watered down beer. And tea, of course, is brought to them through global trade facilitated by coal-powered transportation. And the tea is being drunk with sugar, right, also imported from abroad. And most people could no longer imagine a world without cheap and abundant energy, right? That meant the enjoyment of all of these things. If anybody's read Adam Smith, one of my favorite bits of language that he uses is enjoyments. He's always talking about the enjoyments that trade can bring to people. And so the second thing I want to say about all of this is the overlap between economic growth, fossil fuel consumption, and democracy. And this point is more nuanced and possibly controversial, so we can talk about it in the Q&A if you'd like. So the relationship then between economic growth and fossil fuels, just to give you sort of a more direct comparison, you can see that the graphs have very similar trajectories, right? Global carbon emissions and economic growth map onto each other very nicely. And of course, this is at the heart of contemporary debates about climate change. Everyone agrees, well, not everyone, most people agree that we should abandon fossil fuels, but almost nobody wants to abandon growth. And rather than talking about learning how to recalibrate our sense of what normal energy consumption might look like, right, we talk endlessly about having to develop renewable sources of energy instead. And I think that history has suggested, right, that we can't have substantial economic growth without the voracious consumption of some form of energy. And I would argue that this reliance on economic growth and therefore energy, cheap energy, is the result of not wanting to make harder choices about the distribution of wealth and equality when it comes to access to resources. And I'm guessing you've all heard the phrase, right, immortalized by John F. Kennedy, that a rising tide lifts all boats. This is a cartoon I like to share with my students that gets at the idea of economic growth being good for everybody, right? And then the people at the end saying, but we don't have a boat, as their shoreline disappears with rising sea levels. And then here's the second one that I also like to show my students. Getting back to my notes. Right, so the idea then is that economic growth is good for everyone. And as long as the economy is growing, everyone's situation is improving, right? From the wealthiest investor down to the most poorly paid wage worker. And so rather than asking the rich to share their wealth with the poor, governments instead can focus on economic growth, arguing that everybody will benefit without having to give anything up. Within the context of climate change debates, that argument gets scaled up to a global level. And states are now saying that we can't abandon economic growth because the poorest parts of the globe have yet to industrialize, right, in a way that Europe did in the 19th century. They've yet to enjoy the comforts, right, that we've all grown accustomed to and take for granted. And it wouldn't be fair to say things like India and Peru can't enjoy the kinds of things that we get to enjoy, right? And again, this conversation happens rather than having a conversation about whether or not Britain or the United States or Japan should share some of its wealth, right, with the rest of the world. So let's make the conversation a bit more complicated. And so I said I wanted to talk about democracy. So let's move on to that. Before the Industrial Revolution, of course, most of the world was governed by kings and emperors, right? And by the 20th century, much of the planet had converted to some form, right, of democratic or representative government. There are massive revolutions in the United States, Haiti, and France in the 18th century. Over the course of the 19th century, of course, Britain kind of slowly but surely opens up its government, the participation of less affluent men. Women, of course, get included in the 20th century. And so how is all of this related to fossil fuels and economic growth, right? The people who led these political revolutions, for the most part, were people who had grown wealthy thanks to the increase in commercial activity that came with the Industrial Revolution. They were making money in textiles, railways, the slave trade, banking, and they were angry that they didn't have the same kinds of political power that the aristocracy enjoyed. And you can say this about the French Revolution, you can say this about the American Revolution, same thing, in Germany. And so that's the first part of the story. And then the second part has to do with workers. So of course, they're not wealthy. They're not the ones who are initially pushing for change. Most of the time they get on board with these revolutionary activities, but they're brought in later. What's important in terms of the argument that I want to make is that they're essential to the economic growth that is the consequence of the Industrial Revolution, right? And the wealth that is being accrued by the people who are pushing for political opening. And this is because, right, the railway and textile magnates need these workers, right, to perform essential forms of labor in order for them to grow their industrial enterprises. So they need dockers to load and unload all of these commodities that I was talking about, right? And at first, the conditions for this work are fairly terrible, right? Bad pay, long hours, quite dangerous conditions, and the workers begin to ask for more. Lots of times, of course, they're met with resistance, sometimes violent resistance. There are strikes happening across the 19th century over and over again. And slowly, right, the people who do have wealth begin to trickle some of that out, right? And improve working conditions and make things a bit safer and cut down the working day and say, fine, we won't make kids go to factories, right? But it's a slow process of opening up. And I would argue that the reason, right, that they're able to bring their minds and their hearts to do this is that they're experiencing massive amounts of wealth increase, right, personally. And we all have a much easier time sharing stuff if we have tons, right? And we know that more is coming, right? It's once we have a finite pool of resources that most of us start to operate in a scarcity mindset and have a harder time sharing, right? And so because the pie, right, is getting bigger, it's easier to think about everybody having a larger slice. Right. So that's broadly the link between fossil fuel consumption, economic growth, and democracy that historians have been talking about. And the argument has perhaps most sort of notably been advanced by this historian, Dipesh Chakrabarty, in this article that I have up on the slide. I don't recommend teaching it to young people. It's incredibly difficult to read. My undergraduates had never know what to make of it, but it's really quite smart and well done. And broadly in the article, he's asking us to rethink the narrative that we've constructed about the last 250 years in light of this new knowledge, right? That it was not only a period of increasing democratic freedoms, but was also the dawn of anthropogenic climate change. And so here's a snippet from his article. He writes, most of our freedoms so far have been energy intensive. In no discussion of freedom in the period since the Enlightenment was there ever any awareness of the geological agency that human beings were acquiring at the same time and through processes closely linked to their acquisition of freedom. And so then later he asks, so has the period from 1750 to now been one of freedom or that of the Anthropocene? Is the Anthropocene a critique of the narratives of freedom, of the geological, I can't see the rest of it, sorry. Is the geological agency of humans the price we pay for the pursuit of freedom? In some ways, yes. He's become extremely unpopular for advancing this argument for reasons I'm sure you'll understand. And so I think that one of the consequences for me anyways of having read this article is to ask myself the question, how do we foster democracy and freedom without growth? And here I think one of the most important things to keep in mind is that just because we might have won these freedoms as a consequence of the economic growth that came with abundant, cheap coal, that doesn't mean that that's how we have to maintain them, right? Or even expand them, given that the world is hardly an entirely just place, right? We have lots of work still to do. So I think we're free to come up with new kinds of mechanisms, new political philosophies, right? New arguments for freedom that can be decoupled from fossil fuels. And I think in some ways that's probably one of the most important tasks that humanists and social scientists have before them in light of the climate crisis. Right. And so, as I just said, right, lots of people in the world still haven't really benefited from the energy intensive freedoms that Chakrabarty talks about. And so again, one of the big questions I think we have to ask ourselves is, how do we expand that level of comfort, right, democracy, freedom, without engaging in self-destructive economic growth? And so one person who's asked this question is Thomas Piketty. Oh no, I took out my Piketty slide. Hang on, I'll just talk about him. Pretty well-known French economist, and wrote an entire book about the history of growth and inequality. And he has some pretty interesting proposals for how to address this very question, proposals that are wildly unpopular, and you'll know why as soon as I tell you what they are. So his first proposal is to introduce a progressive global wealth tax of 90, and so that would be, Jeff Bezos, right, would have to pay a tax, and that money might be redistributed to people living in India, right? So that's his first idea. His second proposal is a 99% tax on inheritance, which, yes, right, imagine telling that to Prince George, right? You'll pay 99% on your inheritance. Not going to happen. But these are the kinds of things that people are thinking about. So that's what I wanted to say about this history of economic growth, democracy, and the Industrial Revolution. And so now I'll pivot to the second part of the talk and think about the history of environmental awareness. And so when I teach my class on climate change, I often teach the article that I have cited here in this slide, which I think is a bit easier to read for younger humans. And the article looks at a wide variety of examples of environmental awareness that existed prior to the 20th century. And they frame this with the phrase joyful apocalypse, which I kind of like. And so they argue, right, that our usual understanding of all of this is that we jumped on the fossil fuel bandwagon with the Industrial Revolution, happy to enjoy the fruits of cheap coal, without having any idea that we were destroying the environment at the same time, right? Only to realize later what we had done, and that we were totally, joyfully ignorant that we had brought about this apocalypse. And so they give us examples, for instance, of naturalists understanding already in the early 16th century that humans had a massive effect on the environment, and that in fact nature was no longer a gift from God, right? That it was no longer immutable and controlled by divine power, but rather that humans could exercise force on nature. And a lot of this has to do with the development of modern science. One example that I love to give my students is that some people believed that Egypt used to be this lush Edenic paradise, because the assumption was that that only that a society that was capable of building pyramids and being as grand as Pharaoh era Egypt had to have had a climate that was similar to the one in Northern Europe, right? They couldn't even fathom that you could be living in a desert and be advanced enough to build a pyramid. And so their argument was that Egypt experienced desertification when it became corrupt and barbarous, and the Pharaoh tradition fell apart, which is kind of an amazing argument to unpack with students, right? There's like some weird historical causality happening there, right? And of course, at the forefront of all of this is Francis Bacon, who told us that we could dominate nature and bend it to our will, right? That the earth was completely knowable, completely controllable. There were others who were less optimistic, of course, about our ability to harness nature. Deforestation, for instance, was a hot button issue in the 18th and 19th centuries. Monarchs everywhere were busy clearing forests in order to supply increasingly large navies and also towns, right? Lots of urbanization happening in this period. And so lots of people were worrying about the consequences of deforestation. When Caribbean colonies were visited by a drought in the late 18th century, many speculated that it was brought on by the clearing of forests for agricultural purposes. And they're not totally wrong about the science there, not totally right either, but their instincts were not so off. By the middle of the 19th century, we've got people like Charles Fourier, who's perhaps sort of most widely known for his ideas about utopian communal living, but he also wrote a fair bit about science and the environment. And he wrote here, the method of doubt must be applied to civilization. We must doubt its necessity, its excellence, and its permanence. He also talked about, quote, a decline in the health of the planet, right? And that decline in the health of the planet was the result of civilization. So ideas that sound very contemporary, right? Coming out of an early 19th century thinker. How am I for time? I don't even know what time it is.
It is 2 minutes past 5. So you're
okay.
Definitely good for at least another quarter of an hour.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'll give you one more example. So another Frenchman, because I am originally a French historian, Eugène Huzard was a lawyer in France, and also had reservations about civilization and its effects on the planet. And well, there are two things he said that I think are quite interesting. So one is that by definition, science is experimental. So you never really know what the results are going to be. You can have an hypothesis about what the results will be, but you can't be sure. And so sometimes I like to teach Huzard alongside contemporary ideas about geoengineering as a solution to climate change, right? Huzard would say, you think you know what you're doing if you shoot something up into the atmosphere to try and cool the planet, but we won't actually know, right, until we've done it. And the risk associated with that kind of move is intolerable to Huzard, right? And he says here, right, in the quote that I have up on the slide, can we predict the dire influence that deforestation will have on the organic kingdom and on our health? Not at all. But instead of destroying them, we should be conserving them religiously. Have we forgotten that vegetation is not only essential to man for food, for heating and cooking his food, but above all for breathing, which is the first condition of organic life, right? So he's got this very holistic understanding of the planet and our relationship with it, right? That we are entirely dependent on the planet for our lives. And so we shouldn't be experimenting with it, right? In these dangerous ways. Maybe the last quote from Hazar, just because it's such a good one. He wrote, "When one sees something as limited as the earth and a power as unlimited as that of man armed with the lever of science, one can only wonder what impact this power will have one day on our poor, small earth," right? And I think we also tend to think that our understanding of the earth as this kind of global, planetary, holistic kind of space, right, didn't really hit until the 20th century. Lots have been written about the photograph of the Earth from space that appeared in the late 1960s as a moment when we kind of understood that the Earth was this fragile thing out there floating in the universe, right? And I feel like Hazar is already speaking in that register 100 years or so before we went up into space. Right. And so for at least 200 years, we've had lots of people warning us against the possible consequences of too much civilization, right? And I feel here like civilization can be a decent proxy for economic growth in the way that these people are talking about it. And as I said earlier, a lot of my students come to class thinking that the only barrier to action on climate change is knowledge, and that, you know, we didn't really know about climate change until the 80s or 90s. And now that we know about it, we'll be able to do something about it. And of course, my class becomes very depressing for these kinds of students because then they realize that knowledge, in fact, is not the barrier to action, right? Sometimes the barrier to action is the vested interest of those who enjoy all of the fruits of that economic growth, right? It's about politics. Either I was super funny or something else is happening.
If you make sure everyone's muted, please, apart from Venus.
Another book that I think teaches really well on the subject of climate change is Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything. And this could absolutely be taught to secondary level students. And she talks about Francis Bacon and the history of trying to control the planet. She uses the term extractivism to sort of, what's what I'm looking for, encompass Bacon's approach to the planet. And one of the big arguments that she advances, and she's not the only person to do this, is that climate change above all else is a social problem, right? It's not a technical problem, it's not a scientific problem, or at least it is in part, right? But that ultimately it's a social problem. And that if we're going to address climate change in any kind of meaningful way, we have to think about politics, we have to think about the different social groups that are stakeholders in all of these various issues. And I think one of the areas in which we see this most clearly is in the conversation about climate refugees and the threat that they might pose, right? There's stuff in the media constantly. This is just a small smattering of things that have appeared in The Guardian in the last year. And in the class that I teach, we look at this book, which thinks about climate refugees in a particular example. This is in the Peruvian Andes, where climate-induced glacial melt has led to repeated landslides as these moraine lakes exceed their boundaries and turn into landslides. And I think one of the great things about this book is that it teaches us about what's at stake for people who might be in these threatened areas, right? I mean, living in Britain, you know, worst case scenario, things are a bit colder, a bit hotter. The climate here is so mild that it's not really a big deal, right? Whereas a landslide is a really serious threat to a community. And he talks about things like ancestral ties to the area, people not wanting to relocate, for instance, because their parents or their grandparents might be buried in the local cemetery. You don't want to leave those people behind. And, you know, a real sort of understanding of how people get tied to landscape and geography, right? And of course, once upon a time, when humans were threatened with something serious, environmentally, we would just move, right? But that's when our settlements were fairly rudimentary and it was relatively easy for us to get up and move. But now we have skyscrapers and bridges and, a channel, right? Massive investments that are much harder for people to walk away from. It's also the case, of course, right, that in a pre-modern situation, people didn't have to think too much about whether there was a job available to them at the other end of a move, right? As long as there was land available, and most of the time, there was, you could farm and pick up where you left off. Not to say that it was easy, of course, but that it was doable in a way that just isn't today. And so instead, of thinking about relocating, we end up doing totally insane things, right? My favorite example is the city of Miami. It's one of the fastest growing cities in the United States. Every single scientific prediction has it underwater, right, by the end of the century. And so billions of dollars are being spent to artificially raise roads, increase water barriers, to protect the city of Miami, right? But again, all of the science suggests that none of these efforts are ever going to last over the long term, right? If sea level rise is what we think it's going to be. And if any of you have read Amitav Ghosh's The Great Derangement, I feel like this is a great example of deranged, thinking when it comes to the threat of climate change. And so then the last thing that I wanted to talk about, and it might be a bit rushed since I spent too much time on the first two bits, is thinking about what constitutes normal energy consumption. Alfred Crosby, who's one of the first environmental historians, I'm not sure if he's still alive actually, thought a lot about this question of what constituted normal. I won't read the quote I have up for the sake of time, but he wants us to rethink what constitutes normal, right? And I always try to reiterate to my students that I'm not asking them to, join Amish communities and go back to farming, right? I think we can all acknowledge that there's a big difference between giving up some comforts, right, of late industrial capitalism and going back to an agrarian economy, right? Maybe recalibrating normal is about, limiting domestic flights, right, which is something that France just did. If you can only take a train internally, right? That's an easy kind of low-hanging fruit kind of option, right? Or thinking about eating less meat, right? These are much smaller, much easier to accept kind of recalibrations of what constitutes normal for most citizens, right? So I just want to reiterate that I'm not asking us to go back to living like we lived before the Industrial Revolution. I feel like most women in the world would agree that we do not want to go back to the 19th or 18th centuries, right? Those freedoms were really important for us. And so, trying to think about how to wrap up. Right, getting back to historians then, and what we can offer to all of this. I think one of the great things about historians, right, is that we have this long view, and we're aware of this sort of longer cultural memory. And we know that a lot of the comforts that we take for granted are relatively new, right? Things that our grandparents or great-grandparents never could have enjoyed. Things like fresh fruit in winter, right? I mean, who ate an avocado before the 1970s if you didn't live in Latin America, right? And these are all things that we now take for granted and things that we believe, right, that we couldn't possibly give up. But I feel like most of us, as much as I love guacamole, right, could probably live happy, fulfilling lives without having access to avocados, right? Or without having access to strawberries in the middle of February. So that's just a small example, right? Or a personal vehicle, right? Again, most of our grandparents, great-grandparents didn't have personal vehicles. But I feel like that's a life that I could accept, right? They had penicillin, they had access to decent medical care. These are the things that we should be thinking about that actually really matter to quality of life, right? And just when my students are starting to get really depressed towards the end of the course, I take them to John Stuart Mill. And John Stuart Mill, of course, morally interesting character, right? Made a lot of money off the East India Company, but had lots of interesting thoughts about the economy and what we might be able to achieve in the future. And he imagined a world without growth as quite a lovely place to live, because his argument was that growth turned us into the worst versions of ourselves. We were competitive and acquisitive, right? Violent, but that once we had finished growing, we might be able to sit back, see what we've accomplished, and think about how best to organize our lives so we could maximize everybody's happiness, right? As a true utilitarian would want to do. And so he writes here, a stationary condition of capital and population implies no stationary state of human improvement. There could be as much scope as ever for all kinds of mental culture and moral and social progress. And that's an idea that I really like to leave my students with, because it makes them feel better about the possibilities for the future in which growth might be less robust, I should say, than it has been in the past. Yes, and so maybe I'll stop there. That wasn't a very authoritative conclusion, but I think we're running out of time, and I want to make sure that there's an opportunity to ask questions or have a discussion. I will stop sharing there.
Thank you, Venus. I think between your talk at the HA conference and this evening, I've got everything I wanted noted down in my notebook now. So that's good.
And you should have just, I'm happy to send you, I write everything down because I'm type A. So I'm like very happy to just send you the.
saved my hands actually, but it is actually really good to revisit something. We don't do that often enough because I've got a lot of different things from that talk this time around. So thank you so much. That was superb. Okay, so hang on, I'm going to stop spotlighting you so that I can see everyone on the screen. Hi to those who have just who joined during the talk. Great to see you. So we have 15 minutes. So Venus has timed it to perfection because we actually have a reasonable chunk of time for some questions and discussion. I've got various things that I would like to ask, but I'm going to give you a moment first. You can either put something in the chat or you can raise your hand. We can be very informal. So maybe while people are having a think, I could ask I've got so many questions, but I'll start with, it's partly a observation and partly a question. So as you know, Venus, because you feature in it, one of the modules that we've been writing for the new Centre for Climate Change and Sustainability Education, specifically for history teachers, looks at the Industrial Revolution. This is specifically for secondary teachers. And in that module, one of the points that I make is that when we teach about the Industrial Revolution, which is one of the most obvious topics we teach that has a direct relationship to the climate crisis, teachers tend to end in, and correct me if I'm wrong, people in the room, but certainly in my experience, people tend to end in about 1870-ish and don't go much further than that. It's a kind of obvious question, really, Venus, but you know, clearly we need to encourage teachers to go further than that, because, you know, if you look even at coal consumption, although coal consumption is increasing during the 19th century, it's in the 20th century actually that it really takes off. So that's part observation, part sort of question.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. Yeah, peak coal consumption doesn't happen until the 20th century. And this gets back to my aside about decolonization. And so I think, you know, one of the ways that we could reframe our teaching of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century is to think about its connection to imperialism and the forcible methods, right, that were used to keep other places in the world from industrializing on their own. So for instance, India is a case that I sometimes use in my own teaching. You know, Indian textile manufacturing was further along than British textile manufacturing at the beginning of the 19th century, but Britain didn't want the competition. And because Britain eventually had a lot of control in India, obviously, they were able to suppress Indian industrialization. And so once decolonization happens sort of slowly, right, between the 1930s and 1950s or 60s, all of these countries that had forcibly been kept from experiencing industrialization begin to push for it really aggressively in a lot of cases because, well, for obvious reasons, right? People wanted to enjoy the comforts that everybody else was enjoying. But then also there's a sense that as these democratic governments established themselves, that in order to gain legitimacy in the eyes of their citizens, they had to provide these things, right? Because it became expected that if you are the citizen of a modern country, you have access to an electrical grid, right? You have access to transportation, and you have access to these goods, right, that are circulating across the globe. And so that's one of the reasons that you see that massive spike in carbon emissions around 1950s. And so I think, you can think about the Industrial Revolution as something that happens first in Europe and is very deliberately held back from happening elsewhere. And then it's kind of like a delayed joining, right, about 100 years later. But I think you have to see that as part of the same process, right? Mm-hmm. There's a continuum there.
Hello? Well, we'll do our best to make that case to
I know I saw them comment in the chat, and I feel the same way as well at university. It's just like, how do you cram something else in, especially when students have exams that are set by somebody else, and so you have to make sure that they're prepared for the exams that you have no control over. It's horrible. It's really I just try to get like one little thing in on the environment when I teach the painfully traditional 19th century European survey course at Oxford. Yeah.
I mean, there is a sense, and please other people jump in, there is a sense amongst many of us that the school curriculum just isn't fit for purpose anymore. I mean, it's designed for a different time. A geography colleague of mine who's now in New Zealand, he refers to it as the fossil curriculum. Curriculum designed for a time when fossil fuels were okay, and it's becoming fossilized. And at the moment we don't see any immediate cause for change. I don't know, what do people think about a new government? Do you think it's going to bring rapid curriculum change? I'm not sure.
I think that's all right saying. I think the Labour Party did commit to the was it the climate education bill, I think.
Yeah, they did.
So
yeah.
There is some hope there, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, the climate education bill does, in one of its first clauses, is to embed issues of climate change sustainability across the whole curriculum. But I just, it comes down to a matter of speed, really, and how long that will take. Any other questions for Venus while we've got her here? I mean, I'd be really interested. Don't mean to put Tom and Star on the spot here, but I'd be really interested in a North American perspective on this too. And how is the Industrial Revolution taught in North America, and what are the implications of Venus's talk?
So I'm from Oklahoma, which, if you don't know, is the oil, or was one of the oil capitals of the United States. My dad worked in the oil business my entire life. So when you have that, when you grow up with oil as number one, and that it's the reason we have a state economy, and it's the reason we have good schools, and it's the reason you're kind of ingrained in that's a good thing. And it's so in Oklahoma, and the gas fracking and all that other stuff happens in Oklahoma also. And so these are major industries in our state, and they give a lot of money to our schools. They give a lot of money to these different entities that if we're not there, we would probably be nothing. So you have to remember that this knowledge that we're talking about today, and the knowledge that we've started learning about in my adulthood, particularly me, is counteractive to how I grew up. And you'll learn that in Texas, Oklahoma, Alaska. The reason I could live was because of oil, and the reason, and the gas industry is major in Oklahoma too. So I have that connection of having a livelihood to oil. And so, like, a lot of people don't take that into consideration if they didn't grow up or have no idea how that is. And so I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying, but in Oklahoma particularly, they do try to quote unquote clean up. So they'll have all these commercials of all this, the land looks awful and, all the equipment's just laying there, et cetera, et cetera. And then they go in and clean it up, and then they show the nice pictures with the flowers and the stuff like that. But the in-between part, they don't explain. So it makes it look like this, this livelihood that we have in this state, which is still huge, and people make millions and millions of dollars. Okay. Then look, we did the damage, but looky here, we fixed it. So the in-between is not taught. And I'm going to talk from Oklahoma since I can, because they're my state. I can talk bad about them. We have a government and a state legislator that is very much married to these industries and a lot of their money. The reason that they become state legislators and then senators, etc., at the national level is because of this type of money and these type of lobbying that goes on. And so it's really hard to put any kind of curriculum in to the state like Oklahoma that you guys are talking about. That's why I wanted to be a part of this group, because it's not American. I like to hear from others, okay, and especially my Canadian friends, because we're next door to each other, but they also do a lot of things that we do in the United States, but man, they do it better. And just poor the United States, I'm gonna kind of yaw about them, but there's a lot of greed that goes on, and there's not a lot of solutions for that. And that is our country. That's how we were built. And so I don't think that people want to change, and Oklahoma's not going to change. So there's absolutely no climate change education that's going to be allowed, like you're talking about, Venus. That is not going to happen in Oklahoma. Like, not going to happen. And as a former teacher in Oklahoma, you don't step on those toes, because you'll be shut up really quickly. And powerful people, their children go to these different schools. And so, you don't do that. I worked in a private school, and people that ran the state and doctors and lawyers and oil people, they were the parents. So you don't step on their toes, so to speak, or even question. And so that's my experience. I can't speak for all Americans, and I sure can't speak for every state, but I can probably tell you Texas and Oklahoma were very similar in that aspect of you're emotionally attached to that because your livelihood came from that. And so it's really hard to detach from that. But those of us like myself who will learn and listen and love to be in groups like this, but there's not a lot of me in Oklahoma that are teachers. So that's why I like to come here, and I appreciate Venus, especially today. But so that's my perspective, and you can kind of think about that not as an overall American perspective, because it's not true, because we're so massive, but I think that states that have a lot of oil and natural gas, that emotionally we're attached to that as people, and so we can't sometimes see it as wrong.
Thank you, Star. Thank you. And it's really important that we understand those different contexts. Actually, it's kind of makes me rather glad that I'm in England, and I don't often think that in terms of the school curriculum, but we have different sorts of challenges, but that's a really particular challenge. Venus, I don't know whether you want to come in there.
No, I mean, just to say maybe that in some ways, Star is in a better position than most of us to think about how climate change is a social problem, right? In that, you have contact with people for whom this is a live issue in a way that most of us don't, right? And so you might have insight into what it could possibly take, right? Or what might work to get people to even start to have the conversation, right? In a way that a lot of us don't, because I don't know anybody who works in the oil industry, right? Or in the energy industry. And so you might have access to an understanding of this, right? That that you could use somehow. Although I imagine it, yeah, I used to live in Missouri, so I know what it's like to live in a really conservative state, and tried to teach about Monsanto in St. Louis. So it's tricky, but yeah, good luck.
I'm really glad that you've kept going with this group, Star, because it's great to have you here.
We are.
Oh,
I was just going to add, I know we're running short of time, but I just want to add, as Venus knows, Canada, we're provinces, and they all have their own government, and certainly one of them, Alberta, could be called a petrol state, and has many similarities to what Starr described for Oklahoma. And one could also argue that Canada is a petrol state to some extent. And in British Columbia, it's we have it's very different in terms of the curriculum, in terms of openness, but it depends on the governments that get elected, and we may have a change of government federally that will be sad. But anyway, it's not. I wish it were quite the paradise that Starr suggests for us, and we do have some very good progressive things going, but we have big challenges. So I'll end it there.
thanks, Tom.
Our products and prisoners of our history. In Ontario, from the end of World War II to the mid-1970s, we had a compulsory grade 9 course on British history, meant mostly English. But as a student and then a teacher of it, we were able to look at Thomas Newcomen, James Watt, because we decided industrialization was a big deal for Britain and the world. And every once in a while, some folks, if there was a smog day, would link climate to the history. And then, of course, things changed. I suppose what the moral of the story might be, if this is a big deal, we need to be more democratic and timely. I noticed that in Delhi, they've had once again, a huge issue with smog and people dying. There we go.
John, thank you. Great to have you here today. And we're out of time, I'm afraid. But Venus, can I say a huge thank you again for the talk? I think maybe I need to hear it a third time to really kind of make sure I've got every bit of that. Maybe you could just
send you the document.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
That'd be great. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. We'll be in touch about the next session, which will be in January. We will confirm the exact date with you very, very soon. But thanks ever so much. Hope you all have a really good evening and see you soon.